In a small, bustling town, a young boy's act of kindness turned into a moment that would change everything. On what seemed like any ordinary day, he walked into a local store, not for himself, but to help. He saw an elderly customer struggling with a heavy load, and without hesitation, he stepped in, offering his assistance. What should have been a simple, good deed quickly spiraled into an unexpected confrontation. As he helped, a store employee noticed him and, instead of appreciating his kindness, scolded him in front of everyone. The boy stood there, stunned, the weight of the words cutting deeper than anyone could see. The store went quiet for a moment as people turned to look. Some eyes were filled with confusion, others with disbelief. The boy, still holding the bags in his hands, felt the sting of being misunderstood. He wasn't doing anything wrong, he was just trying to help. But why was he being treated this way? Was it because of who he was? Was it the way he was perceived by others? The moment lasted what felt like forever, but in reality it was just a few seconds that would stick with him for much longer. As the employee continued, the boy, trying to hold back tears, couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. He had been taught that helping others was one of the greatest things he could do in life, yet here he was, scolded for doing just that. The words echoed in his mind, "You don't belong here." But what happened next, the way the boy handled the situation, would leave everyone in the store, and maybe even you watching this video, completely shocked. In that moment, he didn't give in to anger, or shame, or embarrassment. Instead, he did something so powerful that no one saw it coming. What he said next, how he stood tall despite the harsh words, and how he turned the entire situation around will blow your mind. This wasn't just about a store incident. It was about standing up for what's right, even when others don't understand. It was about defying expectations and showing that, sometimes, kindness is the greatest form of rebellion. But this is only the beginning of the story. What he did next is something you'll want to hear. The journey he embarked on after this moment will inspire anyone who has ever faced a challenge or been misunderstood. Stay tuned, because what happens next is not just a comeback, it's a lesson in strength, resilience, and the power of believing in yourself, no matter the odds. Will this boy's incredible response change everything, or will it be too late to turn the tide? You won't want to miss the next part of the story. Stay with us as we reveal what happens when someone refuses to stay quiet in the face of adversity. This comeback will leave you speechless. After the scolding, the boy stood there in silence for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air felt thick, his chest tight. He hadn't expected to be treated like this, especially not when all he wanted to do was help. He looked around the store, hoping to see someone who would understand, someone who would speak up. But the eyes that met his were filled with uncertainty, as if no one knew what to say. There was a strange feeling in the room, a mix of discomfort and tension, but no one spoke up. His heart pounded, and for a brief moment, he thought about walking away. Maybe he should just leave. Maybe it wasn't worth it. But deep down, he knew he couldn't let this go. He had always been taught to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against him. But how? How could he fix this? How could he change how people saw him in a place that felt so unwelcoming? His fingers tightened around the bags in his hands as he took a step forward. He didn't have the answers, but he wasn't about to let this moment define him. Not like this. The employee who had scolded him stood there, arms crossed, waiting for some kind of reaction. Maybe she expected him to apologize, or maybe she just thought he'd shrink back into the background. But she didn't know this boy. She didn't know that the way he was raised, the values instilled in him, had made him stronger than anyone realized. He took a deep breath, forcing the nervousness to fade. This wasn't about being afraid anymore, it was about making a choice. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness there that surprised even him. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his words slow but clear. I was helping. The employee blinked, momentarily taken aback. It wasn't the reaction she expected. But she wasn't ready to back down either. You don't just go around touching people's things, she retorted, her tone sharp and defensive. The boy could feel the heat rise in his chest, but he held it in. The last thing he wanted to do was escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on the bags in his hands, the task he had set out to do in the first place. I was just trying to make it easier for her, he explained quietly, his eyes briefly flicking to the elderly woman who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. She didn't say anything, but there was something in the way she held herself. She didn't look angry or upset, just tired. Tired in a way that felt familiar, like she had been fighting battles of her own for years. The boy couldn't help but wonder what her story was, but for now, he couldn't focus on that. There was something more pressing. The tension in the store had shifted slightly. Some people, who had been standing by the aisles, began to turn their attention back to their shopping. Others watched, unsure of how to react. But no one spoke up. No one defended him. It was as though they were all waiting for someone else to take charge. The boy could feel it, the weight of being alone in a situation where no one was willing to speak out. But that only made him more determined. If no one else was going to stand up for what was right, then he would. He wasn't going to let this pass quietly. He wasn't going to let anyone silence him. He turned to the elderly woman, offering a small, genuine smile. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he said, his voice softer now. I just wanted to help. She nodded, her expression softening. There was something in her eyes that told him she understood. But still, the situation was far from resolved. He had made his point, but there was still so much left to address. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. As he stood there, trying to process everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Why had the employee reacted this way? Was it just a misunderstanding, or was there something deeper at work here? And why had no one stepped in to defend him? Surely, they could see the injustice of it all. Or maybe they were afraid to speak out, afraid of what might happen if they did. The boy felt a sudden wave of frustration. He didn't know how to change everything on his own, but he knew he couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about one moment in a store. This was about something much bigger, a system of beliefs, perceptions, and biases that needed to be challenged. He couldn't stand by and let those around him continue to live in fear of speaking out. He wasn't going to be afraid. Not anymore. He took another deep breath, his hands still gripping the bags, his resolve strengthening with each passing second. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Not until he had done something to make it right. And then, just as he was about to speak again, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the store interrupted the silence. It was quiet at first, almost as if the person wasn't sure if they should speak up. But the voice grew louder, more certain. You're right, the voice said. He was just trying to help. The boy turned to see who had spoken. There, standing at the edge of the aisle, was another customer. He was older than the boy, but his expression was one of quiet understanding. He wasn't smiling, but there was a certain warmth in his gaze that told the boy this wasn't just a passing comment. The man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the employee. The boy blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to speak out. It felt like the whole world had been watching and waiting, but no one had been willing to take that first step. Until now. The employee looked at the man, her expression shifting. She opened her mouth, as if ready to argue, but the man didn't give her the chance. You can't treat people like that, he said firmly, his voice calm but full of authority. Especially not when they're just trying to do something good. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The boy could hardly believe what he was hearing. Someone was finally speaking up for him. But the tension didn't lift immediately. The employee stood her ground, her arms still crossed, but the energy in the room had shifted. There was a crack in her defense now, and the boy could feel it. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, things could start to change. But what would happen next? Would the employee admit she was wrong, or would she double down on her harsh words? And what about the other customers? Would they speak up, or would they stay silent, watching from the sidelines? The boy knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet. He had a chance now, but it wasn't guaranteed. There was still so much more to uncover, so much more to fight for. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let this be the end of his story. Not by a long shot. The air seemed to hang still for just a moment longer, but the boy knew, deep down, that everything was about to change. And soon, the answers he was seeking would come to light, answers that might finally reveal why this moment was so much more than just a misunderstanding. Stay tuned. You won't want to miss what happens next. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The elderly woman who had been quietly observing the scene shifted her position slightly, her gaze moving from the boy to the man who had spoken out. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she stood that suggested she had seen more than her fair share of battles in life. She wasn't just a bystander, there was a depth to her silence that seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken truths. The boy stood there, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. For the first time, he wasn't alone in this battle. The man's words had created a ripple, a shift in the atmosphere. But it wasn't enough to resolve the situation. Not yet. The employee still hadn't backed down, her arms crossed firmly over her chest as she stared at the man with a mix of disbelief and defiance. For a second, the boy wondered if this was the point where everything would finally change. Was this the moment when the truth would be seen? When people would start to realize that kindness wasn't a weakness, that standing up for others wasn't something to be punished? Or was it just another instance of people taking the easy route, letting the tension simmer without ever taking the leap toward resolution? The employee seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes flicking between the man and the boy. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. She wasn't quite sure how to react to the challenge she'd just been handed. And that uncertainty, while brief, was enough to give the boy a glimmer of hope. But then the employee spoke again, her voice cutting through the fragile silence. "You don't know the whole story," she said, her words sharp but almost defensive. "You don't know why things are the way they are." The boy's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean by that? Was there more to this situation than he had realized? What was she implying? His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing made sense. He had simply tried to do something good, something that should have been celebrated, not scolded. The elderly woman, who had been standing quietly nearby, took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but firm. "What's really going on here?" she asked, her gaze not leaving the employee. "Why are you treating him like this?" The employee didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the floor, her jaw tightening, as if weighing her response. The tension was thick again, even heavier now, as if everyone in the room could feel that this moment was about to take a sharp turn. The boy could feel his pulse quicken. He didn't know what to make of the situation anymore. There were so many questions, so many unanswered layers. Why had she said that? What did she mean by the whole story? And why hadn't anyone spoken up before? Why did it feel like everyone was tiptoeing around something no one wanted to acknowledge? The man who had stepped forward earlier gave the employee a long, hard look before speaking again. "We all have our stories, don't we?" His voice was low, but there was a kind of quiet wisdom in it that made the boy pause. "But that doesn't mean we have to treat others like they don't matter." The employee seemed to stiffen, her face flushing. There was something in her reaction that made the boy wonder if she had her own struggles, something she was hiding, something that shaped the way she viewed the world. Maybe she wasn't as unfeeling as she seemed. Maybe her sharp words were just a defense mechanism, a way of protecting herself from something deeper, something painful. The boy glanced back at the elderly woman. She was watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, her eyes not just on the employee but on everyone around her. It was like she was piecing together something no one else could see, something that connected them all in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. The boy could almost feel it, a thread of shared experiences, of quiet stories and hidden truths, all swirling together. But none of them were talking about it. Not yet. The silence seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for someone to break it open, to speak the words that no one dared to say. And then, unexpectedly, the boy found himself speaking again. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that surprised him. "I don't know what your problem is with me," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "but I'm not going to just stand here and take it." His words hung in the air, heavier than he intended. There was a sudden shift in the room, as if the ground had just shifted beneath them. The employee blinked, visibly thrown off by his directness, her earlier confidence faltering. But she didn't respond right away. Instead, she just stood there, looking at him with something that might have been disbelief, or maybe it was guilt. It was hard to tell. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The boy's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He had made a choice in that moment, to speak up, to demand answers, to confront whatever was lurking beneath the surface. And then, just as quickly as the silence had settled, it shattered. The elderly woman, who had been quietly observing, spoke up again. "You're not the only one who's been hurt here," she said, her voice calm but steady. "But that doesn't mean we have to take it out on others." Her words, though soft, seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of experiences, of things left unsaid. The boy could feel it in his chest, a stirring of recognition. She understood. She knew what it was like to be treated unfairly, to feel like an outsider in a world that didn't seem to care. The employee, who had been standing stiffly, seemed to soften at the woman's words. Her posture relaxed slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she just looked down at the floor, her hands now trembling slightly at her sides. It was a small thing, but it was enough to make the boy wonder if the conversation was shifting. Was she starting to see him, finally? Was she beginning to understand that her actions had consequences? But then, before anything else could be said, a voice interrupted them. The manager of the store, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter, stepped forward. His face was calm, but there was a certain tension in his eyes, like he had been waiting for this moment to unfold. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone even but carrying an underlying sense of authority. The boy felt a rush of frustration. Just when things seemed to be getting somewhere, another obstacle appeared. Would the manager side with the employee, or would he finally see the truth of the situation? There was a moment of hesitation. The manager's gaze swept across the room, taking in the people who had been watching the exchange. The boy could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed the scene. Would he take action, or would he brush it off as a misunderstanding, as so many others had done before? The tension in the room was unbearable, each person waiting for the next move. Would the boy finally get the support he needed? Or would this moment fade, like so many others, into silence? The boy held his breath, waiting for the manager to speak. But the answer wasn't coming. Not yet. The room felt like it was closing in around him. The boy's heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The manager's gaze was steady, cold even, as if he were trying to read the situation with no more than a glance. The boy's mind raced, running through all the possibilities of what could happen next. Would the manager side with him? Or would he let the employee's behavior slide, as it had happened so many times before? The elderly woman stood still, but there was an energy in the way she watched the manager that suggested she wasn't going to let this moment slip away. She seemed ready to say something, to push for the truth, but she didn't. She waited, like the others, to see what would unfold. It was as if everyone knew something big was coming but couldn't quite figure out how to make it happen. The manager cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly, and then spoke. "I need to hear both sides of this story. Let's not escalate things, okay?" His tone was calm, but there was a certain firmness that made the boy's stomach twist. He had been in situations before where things were smoothed over, where nothing ever changed. He couldn't afford for this to be one of those times. The employee, visibly rattled now, opened her mouth to speak. But then, she hesitated. The words didn't come right away. Instead, she shifted uneasily on her feet, her eyes darting between the boy and the manager. The boy noticed her hands, which were trembling just slightly. It was subtle, but he could see it. Something was cracking in her. Was it guilt? Fear? Or was she just as unsure as everyone else in the room about what was happening? The elderly woman, still silent, moved closer to the boy. Her eyes never left the employee, and the boy could feel a surge of something in the air, something like anticipation. The atmosphere seemed to be thickening, every moment dragging on longer than the last. The manager stood there, waiting, like he knew the tension needed to play out, but the boy wasn't sure if he had the patience to endure it any longer. Suddenly, the employee spoke, her voice shaky but with an edge that wasn't there before. "You don't understand. It's not that simple," she said, glancing nervously at the manager. "You think you know everything, but you don't know what it's like dealing with him all the time." The boy felt a rush of confusion. What was she talking about? What had he done to deserve this treatment? Was it really about him? Or was it something deeper, something buried under layers of frustration and resentment? Before he could ask, the elderly woman finally spoke. "What's really going on here?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "Why is this happening? What's the real reason you're treating him like this?" The room fell silent, and for the first time, the boy saw the employee's eyes flicker with something more than just defensiveness. It was fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being seen for what she was trying to hide. The manager didn't say anything, but he took a step back, as if he too were waiting for the next move. The boy felt his pulse racing. This was it. The moment where everything could either come to light or dissolve into nothing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He wasn't sure if anyone was. The employee looked up at the manager, her face tight with a mixture of frustration and fear. "I can't do this anymore," she muttered, almost to herself. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine." She turned away, not looking at anyone, and walked quickly to the back of the store. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the sudden silence louder than anything that had come before. The boy stood frozen, his mind racing. What had just happened? Where had she gone? Why had she said that? And what did it mean for the story that was unfolding? The elderly woman moved toward the boy, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes held something. Was it concern? Maybe. Or maybe it was just a quiet understanding that the moment they were in was something bigger than all of them. The manager seemed unsure of what to do next, his brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe we should just," he began, but his words trailed off as the door to the back of the store opened with a sharp creak. The employee stepped back into the room, her eyes wide and panic-stricken. Without a word, she walked toward the counter, her steps uneven. The manager turned to look at her, his face a mix of confusion and caution. The boy's stomach twisted again. He had no idea what was going on, but it was clear that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the air felt like it was about to snap, but the question lingered: what was she going to say? What had just changed? What had the employee seen or realized in those few moments away from the confrontation? The manager finally broke the silence. What's going on? What's really happening here? The employee turned toward him, her face pale. I can't pretend anymore. This job. It's not just about helping people. It's about something much more complicated than that. Her voice wavered as she spoke, and the boy's heart skipped a beat. Was she finally going to tell the truth? Was this the moment everything would be laid bare? But before the employee could speak further, the door to the store swung open again, this time with a force that startled everyone. A tall figure stepped inside, their presence commanding attention. The boy's eyes widened in shock. Who was this new person, and how were they connected to all of this? The employee froze, her face going pale again. The tension in the room was now unbearable, thick with uncertainty. The boy couldn't take it anymore. His voice rose, cutting through the silence. Who are you? The question was simple, but it felt like the only one that mattered now. The figure didn't speak right away. They just stood there, taking in the room with a steady gaze. The boy could see that something was about to shift again, something that would change everything. The energy in the room was electric, the tension on the verge of snapping. Was this the moment of truth? Or was it another layer of complexity about to unfold? Would the boy finally get the answers he had been searching for? Or would this story continue to unfold in ways no one could predict? The boy couldn't help but feel that the climax was just moments away, and everything was about to change. The tall figure at the door didn't say a word at first. They simply stood there, watching everyone in the room, their eyes moving over each person like a careful assessment. The boy's mind was racing. Who was this person? Why had they come at this exact moment? And why did the employee seem so terrified? She was shaking now, visibly rattled, and her hand trembled slightly as she wiped it on her apron. The manager, still processing what had just happened, looked between the employee and the newcomer, a mix of confusion and suspicion on his face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice strained. "What's going on here?" The figure took one step forward, and the boy could see their features more clearly now. They weren't just tall, they had an air of authority, of someone who was used to being in charge. But it wasn't the confident posture that made the boy's breath catch, it was the look in their eyes. It was the kind of look someone had when they were hiding something, something that could change everything in an instant. Finally, the newcomer spoke. "You need to understand something," they said, their voice low but firm. "What you think is happening here isn't the whole story." The room fell silent. The tension was almost unbearable now, as everyone waited for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The employee stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the newcomer. It was clear that whatever they were about to reveal, it was something she wasn't prepared for. The boy's heart began to race again. There had been so many questions up until this point, so many pieces that didn't fit together. But this felt like the moment where everything would shift. The answer he'd been waiting for, the reason behind the treatment, was just within reach. The newcomer took another step forward, moving toward the counter where the employee was standing. "I know what you're thinking," they continued, their eyes now fixed on the employee. "You're wondering if you can keep hiding it. But you can't. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The boy's mind was spinning. Hiding what? What was this person talking about? Why was this suddenly turning into a game of secrets and revelations? He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building with every word spoken. He wanted answers, but the more the newcomer spoke, the more questions it raised. The employee's face had gone pale, and she seemed to shrink under the newcomer's gaze. "I didn't mean to," she began, her voice weak. But the newcomer cut her off sharply, a sense of finality in their tone. You didn't mean to? The figure's voice was ice cold now. This isn't something you just didn't mean to do. This is bigger than you think. The boy's stomach twisted with confusion. What was this? What had been going on behind the scenes? The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't form a picture he recognized. Something darker was at play, something he wasn't prepared to confront. His mind raced, trying to process it all, but nothing made sense. The elderly woman, who had been silently observing all along, stepped forward now. Her expression was one of quiet understanding, but there was something else in her eyes, concern, maybe? Or fear? She had been watching the exchange closely, and now she seemed to be stepping in, as though she knew what was coming. Enough games, the woman said, her voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. Let's stop pretending like we don't know what's really going on here. She turned to face the boy, her eyes briefly meeting his. This isn't just about a boy helping in the store. There's a much bigger story that no one's been telling. The boy's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he had expected was for this moment to be about him in any way. He had thought this was just a minor confrontation, a misunderstanding. But now, it seemed like he had been caught in something far deeper, something much more tangled than he had ever anticipated. The newcomer glanced at the elderly woman, their expression flickering for just a moment. You want to tell him, then? They asked, the challenge clear in their voice. The elderly woman took a deep breath and then turned back to the boy, her gaze full of a complex mixture of regret and resolve. You've been part of something much bigger than you realize, she began slowly. This store. This whole place, it's not just a business. There's a history here, a history that you've unwittingly become a part of. The boy's mind was racing, his breath shallow. He had no idea what she was talking about. He had come here for a job, to help out, to learn something, but now it felt like he had stumbled into a story he wasn't supposed to know. The newcomer nodded, as if confirming something the boy didn't understand yet. Exactly. You've been caught in the crossfire of something that has nothing to do with you. Or maybe, everything to do with you. The last words hung in the air like a challenge. The boy's head spun. The conflict that had started with a simple misunderstanding about helping at the store was now evolving into something unrecognizable. And the more the elderly woman spoke, the more the pieces began to shift in his mind. There was something about this store, about the people who ran it, that had been hidden from him. Something deep and unresolved, something dangerous that he had unknowingly become entangled in. But what was it? What was this secret that had been kept from him? The newcomer stepped back, and the boy felt a rising sense of dread. This wasn't just about the employee anymore. It wasn't just about him. There were forces at work here, pulling the strings, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to handle whatever came next. Every second felt like it could be the one that revealed the truth or tore everything apart. You need to understand, the elderly woman said, her voice quieter now, but still firm. This place has always been a test. And you, boy, you've passed it. Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Before he could ask anything, the door to the back of the store opened again, and the entire room seemed to freeze. Another figure stepped in, their presence casting a shadow over everything. This time, it wasn't just the newcomer and the employee. There were more players, more people, and they were all part of something that the boy hadn't even begun to understand. The stakes were rising, and the boy could feel the weight of it all. Everything was coming to a head, and the truth he had been so desperately searching for was closer than ever. But as the tension thickened, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The figure who stepped through the back door was unlike any of them had expected. The boy's heart raced as the person moved confidently into the room. They weren't just tall, they radiated power, a kind of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Their gaze swept across the room, pausing only when it landed on the boy. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The newcomer, the elderly woman, the employee, all eyes were on the boy. He felt small, caught in a web of confusion and anticipation. His mind was struggling to catch up with the flood of new information, the mystery that had been building around him. But now, it felt like everything was about to come crashing down in one explosive moment. The elderly woman finally spoke again, her voice low and steady. "He doesn't understand yet. None of us do." The new arrival turned their gaze to her, their expression unreadable. "Maybe it's time he did." The boy felt the weight of their words, his pulse quickening. The air was thick with tension, but for the first time, something else seemed to be at play. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they didn't form the image he'd been expecting. This was something far more complex, far more layered. "What do you mean?" the boy finally asked, his voice trembling. "What is all of this? What's going on here?" The elderly woman took a step closer to him. "This store, this place, it's more than just a business. It's a testing ground." The boy's confusion deepened. "A testing ground? For what?" The newcomer gave a small nod, their gaze never leaving the boy. "For people like you. People who've been overlooked, underestimated, and written off by the world.